Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our second Thiel Forum of this academic year. We have an especially exciting event for you today as we learn about a variety of topics, from travel to mathematics to leadership, with a connecting theme being that of journeying to new places, both literally and metaphorically. Our first group of presenters is a faculty and student group of travelers. Dr. Matt Morgan from the DHI and Philosophy Department, Dr. Greg Butcher from the Neuroscience Department, and their students who toured Peru and Spain in May of 2017 will present Thiel Tours Catalunya, España, and Portugal. Dr. Cindy Sutton from the Sociology Department and Director of the Study Abroad program will discuss the upcoming trips to Iceland and Australia and New Zealand. I am proud to present them and their students as they share their study abroad, travels past, travels future experiences with us.
All right, we should be good there. Unfortunately, the clicker doesn't work, so I'm tethered to the podium, so I'm going to stay down here. When I was asked to talk a little bit about the Peru trip, what I wanted to do was to obviously share a few images with you, but also to talk in more general terms why I think it's very useful for students to study abroad. So 20 years ago in January, I boarded my first plane to fly out of the country. I spent 3 months living in London, and I caught the travel bug at that point. It was almost another 16 years before I got to actually go back and do another study abroad, this time from the perspective of being a faculty member instead of a student. I firmly believe that taking advantage of study abroad opportunities while you're a student can really broaden your mind, broaden your perspective on the world, and is really a wonderful way to grow individually. So let's look at a few things that our students did. First, when you get a chance to study abroad, you truly try to immerse yourself in their culture. Some of the most powerful events of our students' trip to Peru didn't happen when they were at the tourist sites, although those were certainly powerful as well, as we'll see in a minute, but happened when we got to actually meet some of the locals, some of the individuals. So in this case, we were invited into the home of one of our tour guide's mothers, who taught us how to make ceviche. So that dish down there at the bottom, the best ceviche I've ever had, and I think that's highly dependent upon the location. I've tried to make the exact same recipe at home, and it just isn't quite right. I think having a Peruvian grandmother in the room helps. A few days later, actually towards the end of our trip, we got a chance to go visit a school group and just basically spend the afternoon playing with some kids. And it was a wonderful opportunity to just share a couple of hours of pure joy. The Thiel students had a wonderful time playing soccer, and then actually just I think most of the time we spent looking at various Snapchat filters. The kids were just fascinated by these. And it was wonderful for me to watch our students and the other students, the Peruvian kids, just kind of play together. It was just wonderful. Also studying abroad gives you a chance to meet new friends. As we all know, Robert does wherever he goes.
He had just a look at his face. You're going to war. Happy Americans.
Now, Cindy's laughing because we have almost an identical video of Robert doing the same thing in the Alps. Different train, this time going downhill, but exactly the same expression. Now, at the very beginning of this clip, you might have seen a woman off to the side here. Robert became fast friends with her, so much so that on a hot sunny day after climbing Machu Picchu, she decided to give him a little bit of shade. It's a great chance to get to meet new people, both in the college community, but also from abroad, different perspectives, different people. Then you get to really test yourself. What are really your limits? What can you challenge yourself to do? For me, part of it was simply climbing this. I mean, it may seem a spectacular ruin. Now imagine it at 9,200 feet above sea level. We were all a little winded by the time we got to the top of this, but it was just incredible. Also for me personally, it was another chance to do something I never thought I'd actually get to do, and that was to see Peru with my father. So we got to go together, and this is a picture taken at the top of Machu Picchu. Wonderful bonding experience for us, and I would encourage you to have similar experiences with your own friends, your own social network, your own family if possible. Then you get to see how to challenge yourself in different ways. So this little line here going back and forth, which you might be able to see, we decided it would be a wonderful idea to get on a bus that was driving 30 miles an hour and go up those switchbacks. That's how we got up to this location, which is sort of the base of Machu Picchu, the entrance of it. We then wandered around here, climbed up to this level, which is known as a contemplation point, and I'm going to let Nick talk a little bit about what he experienced while there. But while we were there, I also got the bright idea with our guide's advice that that wasn't far enough. That we were going to go up this little path there all the way up to the Sun Gate, about another 3,000 feet higher than this point. They do not know safety in Peru, so you're literally walking on the edge of a cliff as you go up this. But from that point then, most of the students decided to follow us up there, or led the way in many cases. And when we got to this point, we're all winded, we're all gasping, and we're just in awe of the beauty, but also the achievement, right? That we've been able to climb to that point and actually look down and see this spectacular beauty. Another thing I would encourage you to do when you're studying abroad is try to get out and actually see things that are not humans, right? No matter where you go, you'll get to see spectacular new wonders of the natural world that are just fundamentally different than what you'll see in Greenville, right? So some of these pictures are from Lima, some of them are from the Amazon, our last few days when we got to wander through the jungle. And it's just absolutely incredible the diversity you get to see. And then take advantage of all the natural wonders you're going to get a chance to actually observe. So we're going to watch a short little clip here. So if you can't tell, this is the base of a tree. So if you've been to Disney World, the fake version of this probably double in height, and that's about the size of the real one. It's incredible, but I think what's more incredible is when you get to actually experience these things with your friends. And so studying through the programs that Thiel has to offer gives you a chance to do that. To really cement relationships, to make new friendships with different people and different cultures, and then just to have a wonderful set of memories. I'm going to turn it over to Nick to talk about what he experienced on the trip.
So I was given the task to come up with one picture that kind of defined the trip. So I was scrolling through 1,500 pictures, and I was like, I don't know what to post about it. So it was either the jungle, because I'm an environmental science major, or this, and I chose Machu Picchu because, like Dr. Butcher said, we were very on the edge of life as we were traveling up the mountain at super fast rates. And you get there and you're like, oh, I've seen pictures of it before, and this can't do it justice at all. It is one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen, and everyone's taking pictures when you first enter, and they're like, no, the picture point is up there, and every 10 feet someone would stop to take a picture, and you finally get up to this point and you would just be taking, they're like, this is where like the best photos are. So we stood there for 30 minutes, took a bunch of amazing photos, and then he's like, now, well, our tour guide was like, now you guys just go sit and think. And so at that point, you're sitting here going, these ruins are some 1,400 years old, like, how are they still there? How was this discovered in 1911? And then it just made you think like, wow, this is all going on not in America. Like the world doesn't evolve around myself, the United States. It's everything's still happening and you're just a part of it and you're just along for the ride. And it was just amazing to sit there and just be immersed in the culture of Peru and just think about how most of the week had already gone by, and this was day like 4 or 5 out of the 6 or 7 that we were like doing stuff. So you're just amazed by all of what you've seen by this point. So it was pretty amazing to just be able to sit back, relax, and think of all the things that you've done and we're about to go see. So it's kind of all I have.
Turn it. Come on down, TJ. And the rest of you guys are presenting for the Spain trip. Concurrently with the Peru expedition, we had 11 students and 2 faculty members go to Spain and Portugal last year for about 12 days. The process of going there was certainly a challenge. You know, an 11, 12-day trip with a good number of students takes some planning. And so, you know, just to give you a perspective on what it takes to actually run one of these things, we began not last May, but the May before, and plus several months, to begin to plan the trip to Spain and the trip to Peru. So we began to identify where we were going, and then we took the summer to sort of figure out which tours we were going to go on. And then in the fall, we began to advertise, we began to bring in scholarships who, you know, from various students, both in the DHI and in the regular students. We began to adjudicate those scholarships, and then we establish how we can get as many students as possible to these wonderful experiences. Meanwhile, in fall, we were also developing a lecture series on Spain and Peru and Portugal that would be run during the spring semester, while the tour itself occurred in May. So it was a bit of a year-long experience for most of these students, both planning, thinking, okay, I want to go, and then figuring out, can I afford it, which is always a challenge, going around trying to rustle up as much funds as they possibly can, signing on, working with EF tours or whatever tour guide we work with, and then going through the spring semester series, lecture series once a week, preparing themselves for what they're going to experience once we get there. And then, of course, the real fun begins when we actually take off from Pittsburgh and we go to Philadelphia and then we go to Barcelona. And then, you know, to really experience what the students experience, I have to hand it over to our crew here. We're going to sort of take you on a bit of a virtual tour of what we experienced during those 11 days.
So thank you, Dr. Morgan. So we're going to give you guys a brief little window or look into our experience on the Iberian Peninsula. So what are we going to be talking about? I'm going to give you a brief description of the itinerary that we received. The students behind me are going to go over the cultural experiences we witnessed, and last but not least, a couple of us are going to give like personal testimonies on how this trip changed us for better. So here's our itinerary. Like Dr. Morgan said, we flew from Pittsburgh to JFK, then JFK to Barcelona, which was an overnight trip. Regrettably, a lot of us didn't sleep. We were too excited. That turned out to be a bad decision after 40 hours of being up. So it was kind of interesting. When they dropped us off in Barcelona, they dropped us off at Las Ramblas. And if you've been watching the news recently, that was kind of where the most recent terrorist attack was at. So we were on that street for 5 hours. It was kind of mind-blowing to see on the television. But anyways, so we were in Barcelona for 2 nights. We then went down the east coast of Valencia. From there, we went to Granada. Granada was, you might refer to it as the place of original flamenco, right? Mm-hmm. Right? So we got to see some original flamenco in Granada. Then we had a beach days in Costa del Sol, or more specifically Marbella. Select few of us got to travel to Gibraltar, to the English colony. Then we went to Seville for a day, which was the home of, or most common place for bullfighting. Then we took a day trip to Toledo, and then 2 days at Madrid. From Madrid, we took a bus to Portugal, where we spent the last 2 days in Lisbon. So what's the definition of culture? The definition of culture is the arts and other manifestations of human intellectual achievements regarded collectively. So the key word here being human intellectual achievement. So when we were coming up with this PowerPoint, we were trying to think of the categories that fall underneath this culture. So we decided on art and architecture, language and religion, entertainment and traditions, and food and drink. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Brittany, and she's going to kind of quickly go over the art and architecture that we witnessed.
Yeah, so art and architecture was very prominent all over Spain and Portugal. Both historic art, your classical arts, but also modern art as well. So starting with a few of these photos, on your left you can see the House of Bones by one of Spain's most famous architects, Gaudi. And then continuing with the Gaudi theme, the bottom picture there is the iguana from Park Güell. And then Gaudi's most famous architectural structure on the right there is La Sagrada Familia. And it's a Catholic basilica. It's still not completely finished yet, so we got to see it as a work in progress. And then just a little bit of modern architecture. You see the Science Museum at the top there from Valencia. And now this next slide here, the 3 photos that kind of go diagonally down the screen, those are photos from the Alhambra, which was a Moorish castle in Granada. So you can see the entirety of the castle there, a reflective pool, and also a little bit of a fountain down in that bottom picture there. And then we all know Picasso, or many of us do, so down on the left bottom corner there is La Guernica, which depicts basically the terrors of war. And then in the top corner there, you see Garden of Earthly Delights by Bosch. And that was in the Prado Museum, which was one of my favorite parts of the trip. It's considered, and it's arguable, to be the second most famous art museum in the world. just under the Louvre.
So I'm going to talk a little about the language and religion of Spain. Spain is a predominantly Catholic country. There are some other religions that filter through as well, but it's mainly Catholic. And like Brittany just talked about, on the left there you see La Sagrada Familia. Started in about 1882, 135 years ago, and it's only about 70% complete. So they estimate that by about 2035 it'll be done. The second picture there, that's a church in Barcelona that I went to. It's obviously not a large cathedral, it's more of like what you might consider a parish church, but still with the higher vaulted ceilings and all those elements. The next picture there is actually rather interesting. It's called the Synagogue El Tránsito. That's the Spanish pronunciation, and then to the Jews, they call it the Synagogue Samuel Levi. And the interesting story with this is it used to be a synagogue for quite a while, and it in turn went to the Catholics, that's why you see the cross up at the top center there, and also to the Moors. And I believe right now it is just simply a historical structure, but the hope is that it will be returned to the Jewish community at some point and continue to serve as a synagogue. The final picture that you see over there is a picture from the cathedral in Toledo with the nice stained rose glass window up there. Then the language of Spain, we call it Spanish, right? Well, not quite. See, when we use Spanish, we say it more of as an all-encompassing language, meaning the Spanish that is spoken in Spain and in Latin America. However, to the Spaniards, they speak Castilla, and then there are other languages, other dialects of Spanish spoken in Latin America. So what you see on the left there is Las Ramblas in Barcelona. I included that picture because that was kind of our first introduction of being thrown into a fully Spanish-speaking culture. And it was pretty interesting hearing nothing but Spanish all around. I rather enjoyed it. The next picture there is, I took a picture of a sign in our first hotel because, again, more Spanish just around us instead of simply English. And the one over there, I think a lot of us would like that. That's a 50% off sale. I think we can all relate to that. And then I think everybody can also relate to the final picture there, the Bacardi symbol. We went to Sitges, which is close to Barcelona, the beach on the eastern coast there. That was where Facundo Bacardi Masso was born. And that's a little museum to his testimony there. It was closed at the time that we went, which we were a little disappointed about. There still need to be in the historic area of Sitges.
I'm Jessa. I'm going to talk about the entertainment and traditions that we experienced while we were in Spain. So, as previously mentioned, the first picture is Las Ramblas, and it was like a really popular street for people to shop on and just spend time. And it was like really cool for that to be our first experience because, as John said, we got to see how people interacted with each other and just it represented their culture so much. The top picture there is Camp Nou, and that is their soccer stadium, which I personally did not get to go to, but a couple of the members from our group went and saw it, and they said that it was incredible. The bottom picture, that is a sandcastle that we saw on one of the beaches, and it was like really popular to see things like that along all the beaches we went to. Their beaches were really nice. I mean, nothing compared to, the States are nothing compared to what we experienced there. And then the last picture is just another one of the beaches we went to. So, in Spain, there is a tradition where from, I believe, 1 to 3, it's the siesta period. And technically, it's supposed to be when people like go home, like all the places close and they're supposed to nap, but usually it's used for like family time and just whatever they need to get done. The top picture is the royal family, and it was really cool because we got to see a lot of the castles while we were there, and we saw some of the palaces. The picture on the far corner is the flamenco show that we went to, and that was probably one of the best experiences there for seeing culture and tradition. I mean, it was like, when you were watching it, they were telling a story about their lives, and it's hard to explain. I mean, you had to be there to experience it. And they actually pulled people out of the crowd, and like everyone in our group, I think, danced during the show, so that was pretty cool too.
My name is Elena, and I'm going to tell everyone a little bit about our food and drink experience. In Spain, we have this section of the day where people go along after work and they get tapas, the tapas bars. And they're extremely popular for everyone because you get a little drink, a couple snacks, and then afterwards, after spending a few hours with your friends, you know, talking about your day, experiencing leisurely hours, drinking, they go home and have dinner around 10 o'clock at night. Very different from what we do. Normally our meal times are just, you eat and then you're done. But they like to experience each other, you know, talks amongst their friends and just relax from their day's work. So a couple of these pictures are what I personally ate and drank whenever I was in Spain. Me and my boyfriend Nick, we spent a lot of time together and going on little dates. So these are a couple of pictures from our dates that we had. Some famous churros in the middle picture, and then some beer on the side. So these are some pictures of our meals as well. The bottom right-hand picture was an average breakfast that we would receive. And then above it are some of the tapas food that we were able to eat whenever we were in Spain. And as you can tell, the big picture on the left, that's Nick drinking an enormous beer. Okay, this thing had been at least 3 bottles of beer in it. It was about $11, and it hit me pretty hard. Sorry. It was, and there were so many people drinking these. Oh my gosh, they were at every single table. So you could tell that definitely beer was one of the biggest things to do in Spain. For Nick, yeah. And most all the other adults.
Alright, just to conclude, 2 or 3 of us are going to give like personal testimonies on how this trip allowed us to grow as a student, as a person. So for me personally, I grew up in Greenville. I went to Greenville High School, and now I'm going to Thiel. So, you know, getting out of the town itself was a big deal, let alone going to a whole new country, a new continent. It allowed me to bond with more Thiel students that I otherwise wouldn't have. Anybody else want to give a personal statement?
So I'm come from a little further away than TJ. I'm from Columbus, but it was still pretty exciting to get to a new continent. Like he said, I've never really had an idea of what it's like to be a foreigner. And like I said earlier, hearing a new language all around me and seeing new customs all around me was pretty incredible. Another thing that I did was I posted on my Facebook page a picture of, I took a screenshot of our location on Google Maps. You all know how that little blue dot shows up and shows where you are on the world. Well, I zoomed out and I showed myself, I'm in Spain. I'm not in America, I'm in Spain. So that really kind of hit me. Pretty cool.
I'm Kyle, and this opportunity was the first time I got out of the country, and it was just like really kind of like shell-shocking to see like a culture that's like more open compared to like how Americans are, especially when we went to like the beaches. Like TJ, the like self-confidence and like openness that they have with one another, it was just like something that like I wasn't used to. And like Elena said with like the tapas, like they're all like social oriented, both their families and friends, like they'll get together even if it's for like an hour, just to like chit chat and catch up with one another. That's just like something that like, I mean, I guess like we do that, but for them it's like more ingrained to like their daily life. Like for us, like catching up with old friends, like you make like a statement to like get there, like it's like once a month, every few months, whatever. But for them it's like once a week, and if you're not doing that, like your friendship card's about to get ripped apart. So like it was just really cool to see like a different culture, and then just kind of like bring that back to like the States, and you kind of like walk around and you're not really thinking about being judged anymore because you're like, well, I've been in another place where like people who should not be wearing Speedos wear Speedos, and it's okay, it's accepted. So it was just really cool to like see that all come together and just really immerse yourself in that for 2 weeks.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Can you pull up that clip just for time? I get to wrap up the study abroad section. These were just the last 2 trips we took. We've also gone to Italy a couple of times. We've been to Greece. We've been to London. We've been to Germany. This coming May, the 2 trips, and there are flyers up here. If you're interested in it, are Australia, New Zealand, and Iceland. There is a scholarship available. There are scholarships available. So the form is on the back. So if you're one of those people thinking, gosh, I'd like to do this, but I could never afford it, you probably can. So please look into that. Talk to me if you want. The only thing that I would add to what's been said is 2 things. We often forget just how young we are. And so one of the things I kept telling my students when we traveled abroad is if you're allowed to, touch the stuff you're looking at, because you're not just seeing history, you're touching it. So when we were going through the Colosseum, I had to keep reminding them, you can touch this. I'm touching the Colosseum. But the other thing that you will learn is about us as professionals. You'll learn about yourself, you'll learn about your friends, but you will learn about us in new ways. And so we wanted to share this clip of Robert.
Okay, run over. Okay. Let's go for it.
Those of you who know Robert, this makes perfect sense. We were looking at that sign, and it was indicating that you could or couldn't hold hands. And so somebody wanted to know why you couldn't or couldn't hold hands, and she was explaining, no, it's a pedestrian zone. And Robert's mind went where Robert goes. And the next thing you knew, we were skipping through Germany together. So you will learn about us as well. So.
To this day, I'm still Father Greg.
Yes, and I'm still Mother Cynthia tonight. So there you go. Are there any questions for any of the study abroad presenters? Really encourage you to think about the trips. If not this coming May, in the next year, it's an amazing opportunity to give you. Thank you.
Special thanks to all of you. I thought those presentations were wonderful, and thank you especially for your testimonials. Our second presenter today is Dr. Russ Richins, Chair of the Math and Computer Science Department, who will discuss the results of a faculty development grant that he recently received. So I believe we can't let him do that for us. Thank you.
So I don't know how fair it is to let the math guy go after travel abroad. I'll do what I can. So I'm going to talk to you today about some research that I did with my faculty development grant, which was to get some equipment to test a numerical algorithm I've been working on for quite a while and kind of improving it over time. So hopefully I don't have a whole lot of time to go into details, but we'll hopefully can give you a little bit of an overview of my goal, and we'll see whether I accomplished it or not. So the equation that I've been studying that I want to solve is the Helmholtz equation, which shows up in a lot of different places. It shows up in all kinds of science and engineering applications. It really shows up anywhere where you're interested in steady state waves. So basically kind of a snapshot of a wave that's not moving. It has physical cousins, and like the Schrodinger equation is closely related and things like that. So this shows up in a lot of places. For one example, if you want to Google, can one hear the shape of the drum? This is a paper that's been around for a long time, but it's one that's won a lot of awards for mathematical exposition. So this should be a good one to read. And the question in there is, if you hear the sound that a drum is making, by that sound, can you identify the shape of the drum, right? So this is related to these waves in the Helmholtz equation. But one of the main problems in solving the Helmholtz equation is that it's kind of hard to do numerically. By numerically, we mean approximating the solution, so something that you can do on a computer. It's pretty easy. In fact, most mathematical equations that we want to solve, most of the interesting ones, it's pretty hard to actually write down a solution to find an analytical solution. So most of the time we have to settle for a numerical approximation. And part of the reason why is if we talk about these waves that are really high frequency, so they oscillate very quickly, you're going to have to use a lot of grid points and a lot of points in your approximation to be able to resolve those waves. And so that by that, what that means about our problem is that there's going to be a lot of unknowns, and it's going to be really hard to solve. It's going to take a lot of computational work to do it. So that's one of the problems that arises, and one of the ways to remedy that is to use parallel processing, to try to do as much as you can at the same time, and that'll speed things up. So that was part of the goal here, is to implement this in parallel so that we can take advantage of that. So the way that I did that is kind of on the cheap. We don't have a lot of high performance computing at Thiel, so what I did is used a graphics processing unit, a GPU. Something like this is something any gamer would have in his or her computer. And the original purpose for these GPUs is to render graphics quickly. If you have a really good game on your computer, it needs to be able to update the graphics on the screen very quickly in order to have those high quality graphics that gamers are interested in. But NVIDIA, which is one of the main manufacturers of these GPUs, realized that there are other applications as well. Really what we have in a GPU is just a bunch of computing cores, right? And those computing cores can all work at the same time. And they work very fast and all at the same time, and so they realized, well, we can make this so that anybody can use it for anything, not just graphics processing. So they introduced this API called CUDA, which is just really an extension of C++ that allows you to program these GPUs to do pretty much anything that you would do in just regular C++, but now you can do it in parallel on this GPU. So for a few $100s, you can get a nice GPU that will allow you to kind of bootstrap your computer into a parallel processing unit and be able to do some parallel computations. So that's what I wanted to test. I want to take this algorithm and test it on that GPU and see if it really sped up my algorithm the way that I thought it should. So to give you kind of a background about the algorithm itself and how it's supposed to work and how it's different than the usual ways that we would solve this equation. So the basis to all of this, and really to kind of a couple aspects of what I'm doing here, is the calculus of variations. And if you've taken calculus, you kind of have the idea behind the calculus of variations. In Calculus 1, we teach our students how to find, you take a function, you look at the graph of the function, it has maybe some bumps in it. You want to find the maximum, you want to find the minimum, right? What's the biggest point, the highest point on that function, what's the lowest point on that function? And in calculus, we tell our students, well, the way that you do that is to look for where the slope of the function is 0, right? If the slope of the function is 0, that means that you're at the top of a peak, or maybe you're at the bottom of a trough. So in the calculus of variations, we take those same ideas and generalize them to more abstract things. Instead of just looking for, the inputs to our functions are just numbers, right? A function that takes a number and spits out another number. These are functionals, we call them in calculus of variations, which take a function as input and spit out a number, right? So now that means that instead of just having a one-dimensional line for our input, now they're infinite dimensional vector spaces. So a couple of infinite dimensional spaces as our underlying space, which complicates things a little bit, but the main ideas are still the same. We want to figure out where the slope is 0, or some generalization of the slope is 0, and look for a maximum or a minimum at those points. Okay, so that's what we're trying to do. So really the same ideas that you learn in Calculus 1, but just generalized to a more abstract setting here. Okay, well usually when you take this Helmholtz equation and you try to solve it, generally the way that it's done is to use what's called the stationary variational principle, which instead of corresponding to one of those maxima or minima, corresponds to just a flat part of the graph, not necessarily a maximum, just a place where it's flat. Well, it turns out that you can think of it as being that these places that are flat but aren't maxes or mins are kind of hard to find in a sense. And that carries over into the numerical method by making the Helmholtz equation, the system of equations that we have to solve here, it becomes indefinite. It makes it a little bit harder to solve than it otherwise would be. So what we prefer to have is what's called a positive definite system. If we have a positive definite system, then there are simpler ways to solve it. There are things we can do that are easier and that are easier to parallelize as well. We can use this, use my GPU on. So that's the goal. Milton and his collaborators quite a while ago discovered a minimization variational principle. So instead of having a stationary principle, now the solution actually comes at a minimum for this principle. Okay, and then, so there's a lot, you don't really need to internalize everything that's going on in those equations, but basically this u, right, is our solution, and eventually we plug that u into this formula, that the one prime here on any quantity, a single prime means it's a real part, a double prime means the imaginary part of a quantity, so we're talking about complex numbers here, right, what numbers that have a real part and an imaginary part. But at the end of the day, all that's really important here is we plug that u in, we do this computation, and we come out with a number. And if we can make that number as small as possible, the choice of u that makes that number as small as possible is the solution to our equation. Okay, so that's what we're looking for. And because this is now a minimization principle, the system of equations that we have to solve become positive definite, right? We get the thing that we wanted, and we can use sort of simpler numerical methods and take advantage of that positive definiteness to solve our equations. So we get a positive definite system of equations. We can use some more simple, there's simpler ways to solve them. But there are also some drawbacks to using this minimization principle. In order to solve for u, we have to really solve two systems of equations, one for the real part and one for the imaginary part. And those systems of equations are much larger than they normally would be, because at the same time we're solving for u, we're also solving for its gradient, which means the two components of that gradient together with u makes it 3 times as large as usual, which might not necessarily be a bad thing. We're getting the positive definite on one hand, but they're larger on the other hand. Maybe, in some cases those may balance out. Some cases it may be still a better method. But we prefer not to have our systems that large. We'd like them to be the same size as we would normally have if we can do that. Another thing that happens is a lot of time in the algorithms that we might use, we have what's called a serial bottleneck, meaning that there are some things that just can't be done at the same time. You have to wait for one part to finish before you can do the next part. And so we also want to avoid that. So we want to be able to, as much as possible, have the computations all being done at the same time, or as many as possible being done at the same time. So we want to avoid that serial bottleneck. Well, it turns out in the same paper, Milton and his collaborators introduced a saddle point variational principle. So another characterization of the solution, this time as a saddle point. So it's not a maximum and not a minimum, but it's like sitting in a saddle, right? If you look at a saddle, one side looks like a maximum, but if you turn around the other side, it looks like a minimum. Right, that's what we call a saddle point. And so if we discretize this system, this variational principle and get a system of equations, we do get some positive definiteness here. That matrix A1 there, where it shows up there and there, is positive definite. And so we want to take advantage of that. My goal is to take advantage of that and use that in the solution. So it turns out that the way we do that is by taking what's called assured decomposition. And it sounds really fancy, but really all it is the method of substitution for solving a system of equations of two variables and two unknowns that you learn, we teach it in Math 101, right? It's just making that substitution. So really all we're doing here is solving for x1 there, and then making that substitution in the other equation for x2 and gathering like terms. And it turns out that this new matrix that shows up here is positive definite, right? So A1 is positive definite, so is this matrix. And because of that, we can solve this system of equations just by using positive definite matrices, right? So that's actually a big deal, just to be able to stick to positive definite matrices. The way that we're going to solve these systems of equations with this positive definite matrix, right? We said that kind of corresponded to a minimum problem, defining a minimum, is we're going to use what's called the descent technique. And basically what this boils down to is saying, well, if I'm on a mountain and I want to get to the bottom, I look around and say, well, it looks like this way's down, that's a fast way to get down, so I'm going to follow that direction. After you go a little while, you look around again and say, okay, which way's the fastest way down? I'm going to follow that direction. And you keep doing that. So that's what a steepest descent technique is. And basically, in calculus, if you take a multivariate calculus, you learn that the steepest descent is always in the opposite direction of the gradient, of basically your derivative, right? You want to move in the direction where the descent happens the quickest. And so that's what we want to do, is follow that steepest descent until we find that minimum, and that's going to be our solution. Because our matrix is positive definite, we can use a method that's called conjugate gradient, where we take these descent directions, and we're trying to make this functional, right? There's our functional. This time it's really a function, I guess, because it's just a vector as the input. And we're trying to make that as small as possible, and we do it by following its gradient in that steepest descent direction. But there's one other requirement, that we want the descent directions that we use to follow a sort of to have this orthogonality condition. Right? So we're basically taking descent directions that are kind of not parallel to each other, but we're making sure that we're going in directions that are in a sense orthogonal, at least orthogonal, kind of like at a 90-degree angle to each other. in a certain sense. This conjugate gradient method, if you look at it and look at the exact, how it works exactly, it should always work. In fact, it's guaranteed to work in at most n iterations, where n is the size of your problem, where the matrix is n by n. But it turns out that that's not the way it works in practice because of rounding error. So when you input numbers into a computer, you always have to round them off, right? A computer can't actually deal with the square root of 2. It can deal with 1.41, whatever. You have to round it at some point. And that error gets amplified because some matrices are what we call poorly conditioned. And because of that poor conditioning, they amplify any error that's already in the system as you try to do these computations. Well, in order to avoid that, we have to use what's called preconditioning. So this tries to reduce the condition number, make the matrix that we're dealing with better conditioned. All right, so what we want to do is kind of sort of split the matrix into two parts, one that's sort of the preconditioning and then the matrix itself. And in that way, we're able to speed up the convergence and actually make this conjugate gradient method work for us. The preconditioner that I had to use for various reasons, this is the only one that I could really get to work well because of the way the software was set up, is called Multigrid. And so what Multigrid does is it uses a very simple method on these matrices, a very simple iterative method of solving these systems of equations. The problem with that method is that it only works really well on reducing the high frequency components of the error. It leaves alone the low frequency components. So the trick that we use in Multigrid is we trick the algorithm into thinking that these low frequency components are actually higher frequency by moving between different grids. Right? If we use, here I'm using just 100 points to represent this sine curve. But if I use only 10 points, it looks much more rough. It looks much more jagged, and that's going to fool this method into thinking that that's a higher frequency component of the error, and it will then work to reduce that. So in Multigrid, we have what's called our standard V cycle. We start with a very fine grid, lots of grid points, and then we start reducing that grid. We start restricting it to a more coarse grid. And then at each step, we apply this simple iterative method, and that starts working on those those lower frequency components of the error until they're eventually reduced, and then we work our way back up through prolongation back to where we were. So we move to coarse grids, and then to finer grids, back up to the finer grids, and as we go, the error should be reduced. All right, so here's my model problem. So you see the results that I got here. That's the algorithm we wanted to use. It should work very well. This multi-grid idea works very well in parallel. We can do lots of computations at the same time. This is the model problem that I used. Epsilon here is the imaginary part of my coefficients. If you care about the boundary problems, they're Neumann boundary conditions. And because of the way everything's set up, right, we're solving positive definite systems. We're using multigrid, which should be easy, multigrid and conjugate gradient, which should be work very well in parallel. And so you can see the results that I got here. Here's with different values of epsilon. And here I'm changing the value of omega. So as omega gets bigger, that means the waves are going to be higher frequency. So at the same time, in order to continue to resolve them, as omega gets bigger, I have to add more and more grid points, right? More and more points in my approximation as well. And so you can see here that the red is just the CPU, right? So just using the standard CPU on my computer. This is the amount of time that it took to solve the problems here. So you can see that it goes up to about 125 or 130 seconds to solve some of the largest problem, the highest frequency problem. This is the GPU. Right? We were able to solve it. It was able to solve that problem in much less time. You can see a little crossover here, right? At the bottom, it takes a little bit extra. When the problem's really small, there's a little bit extra overhead to solve the problems on this GPU, but eventually you're saving a lot of time by solving these problems on the GPU. Same thing here, I mean, similar here. This is just a different value of epsilon, so a bigger imaginary part. That corresponds to more dissipation in the material that the wave is propagating through. So here again, more different values of epsilon, but the same result that the GPU is able to really well outperform the CPU on all of these different problems. So that was the result that we're looking for, that I was happy to see. That when we put this in parallel, we verified that we got exactly what we expected and at a significant speed up in the solution of the Helmholtz equation with this method and in parallel. So that's all I had. Any questions? Greg?
Why does the time to compute in either method go down as epsilon goes up? So if I'm looking at your graphs, the one on the far right, epsilon of 2, the maximum time is about 50 seconds. And as you go down, each one, the maximum time it takes increase. So epsilon 1.72 is about 60. On the last one you said it was about 2 minutes to do it if epsilon is really low.
Right. So why is the time going down as epsilon gets bigger? Right. Epsilon gets bigger. Because that means because there's more dissipation of the material, the waves will damp out quicker, and so there's less motion in the solution, and that makes the system better conditioned. And so the convergence is much faster in the conjugate gradient method. So yeah, it's because of the greater dissipation of the material makes the problem easier to solve. Any other questions? Thank you very much.
There's nothing like seeing people doing what they love to do, right? And speaking in the language that's so familiar to them. So we've had language from our travelers, language from our mathematician, and now we're going to have language from psychology. We have Dr. Shannon Deets, who's an assistant professor of psychology here, who will focus today on leadership and what she has learned as a result of her work with the Pennsylvania Psychological Association. I'm proud to present Dr. Deets.
I'm going to take just a moment to load. As this is loading, I was given the opportunity to work with the Pennsylvania Psychological Association as part of their Emerging Leaders program for the very last year. And this was the inaugural class for the Emerging Leaders program. So it was really exciting that we got to kind of do this, but then also we're continuing with the program to help the new class this year. And it really struck me that in this process, it was really supposed to be a leadership experience, but for me, it was really this combination of everything I do. It was research, it was service, it was professional development, and it was a really exciting experience. So these are me along with 4 other women who were chosen for this class. 3 of us were early career professionals, so folks that have already graduated and working in the clinical field. And then we had 2 graduate students that also joined us for this program. It was a very competitive program. The application was actually quite extensive. It kind of reminded me, for those of you here who have applied for academic jobs, all the paperwork you have to submit for academic jobs. It also required an interview and a letter of recommendation from someone who had worked with me stating that I was in fact capable of leadership material. It was kind of flattering and very interesting that they told me the 2 qualities that they really loved about my application and myself was, 1, I was the only person who did both clinical work and academic work. So everyone else was either one or the other. That's not that unusual in psychology. That's usually how people parse out, right? They choose either academics or clinical. I am a person who doesn't like to choose, so I do both. The other thing is they specifically wanted me to be a part of this program so that I could give them some guidance in qualitative research methodology, because the Pennsylvania Psychological Association was thinking that they wanted to incorporate that more into the science that they're seeing in the processes of research that people are doing. So what did it include? These were the things that came straight from their flyer as far as what are you going to get out of this. So lots of leadership training, lots of exposure to other professionals in the field. And then, of course, it was nice down here. They did give us funding for travel so that we could go to Harrisburg. I actually went to Harrisburg 4 different times to have some training and also to work for Advocacy Day. What's happening? Here we go. But there's more. As part of this, they also did a leadership style assessment, because what do psychologists love to do but give people assessments, right? And so I found out from my assessment that I actually thought was pretty accurate for me, that I tend to be the type of leader where I want everybody's opinion. And so the positive part of that is that everyone feels included. The negative part is for folks that want a little bit more direction, they sometimes are lacking that. So that was important for me to know, that I need to add that to my leadership style. We met with the board every time we went to Harrisburg. The board members are phenomenal people, so I encourage any psychology majors, get involved with PPA, because the board is just very kind. Advocacy Day, I'm going to talk about that a little bit. We actually went and met with our legislators in Harrisburg to talk about issues that were important to the field of psychology. I did a research project, which I'm going to talk about that, and then we presented at the convention, and we had numerous convention kinds of presentations that we were doing. So for my research, I did a qualitative study of the underrepresented populations in the helping professions. And if you take a look at the numerical data in the graphs down below, you would see that over time, it looks like the field of psychology has gotten much more diverse. We have much more women, we have much more individuals who identify as non-white, and so you would think, yay, psychologists doing a great job. However, when I actually went through the process of interviewing people, yes, we have more numbers, but the qualitative experience of these folks is not that of diversity and inclusivity. As matter of fact, we see things where oftentimes they feel like they're lacking that social support from common peers that then allows them to feel like they have a network of protection, and ultimately ends up to their own lack of self-care. They feel like they have to do more. They're representing an entire ethnic group or an entire gender, as opposed to just representing themselves. Really striking, they felt compelled that to be successful in their field, they had to adhere to white male norms. So the field of psychology is over 150 years old, but it seems that there's still kind of this premise that if you want to be successful, you want to act like the psychologists from 150 years ago, right? Having children created a lot of problem for women. There was a lot of bias along the lines of feeling as if they weren't working as hard, they weren't as efficient, they were not as available to clients and things like that. And then another really striking one was that other people, and that included professionals or even clients, seem to have an entitlement mentality to give feedback to people who were non-white or non-male regarding how professional they were, their status, their autonomy, how they could work independently. And this across the board, like I said, from clients to supervisors, it was really this message. We did find some protective factors. If you were male and you were non-white, you had a little bit of protection. If you were male and white, you had a lot more protection, right? That those things kind of worked in your favor. So the way I wanted to apply this research was a couple of different directions. One, I was able to see that subjective measures, qualitative measures are immensely important, right? If we just looked at the strict numbers, it looks like the field of psychology is very diverse, it's very active, it's thriving, but the experience, the lived experience that these individuals have is not one of truly a multicultural tapestry of inclusivity. They're still feeling like, well, I'm here, but I'm on the outside. So I applied this to the way that I teach my diverse students. I've had a number of students that have come to me and said, I want to be a counselor, but I never see anybody on TV that's a counselor that looks like me. I don't even know anybody in my community that's a counselor. How do we do this? The other part of this research is it doesn't just start with graduate school or professional work. There has to be something going on earlier in the education of individuals that we're weeding out people or not helping them to feel like their unique voice is really important to the field. And then it also helped me explore my profession. I love psychology. I love clinicians, right? I love academics. I was hoping that we were gonna be better at this. And so while I'm a little disappointed about the results, it gives me a motivation to make changes, to make this field actually be something that we want it to be, rather than just ignoring it and saying, oh, we have this many more women, we have this many more African Americans, this many more Latinos. It's not really gonna work for us, so we have to do some changes. The way that this went into service, so I am now a mentor for the new emerging leader classes. They do still have the mentor that is part of the General Assembly and the board for the Pennsylvania Psychological Association, but I'm kind of an intermediary for them. We met them at the convention to kind of welcome them and get them started. I've become active in the legislative process of psychology. Yeah, I know, it's one of those things that you're always told you should do, and it's really intimidating. But once you start to do it, it's a great benefit. This is a picture of Michelle Brooks, who is our Pennsylvania senator. So I met her while in Harrisburg at the Capitol. Ironically, she had been at Thiel the day before. So we kind of crossed paths, but we met up there. And I was able to talk to her about a number of initiatives that psychologists are concerned about. One is they would really like to see the start time for high school students be put later in the day. We have lots of evidence that students are not cognitively ready to be awake at 8 o'clock in the morning and studying, right? There's all kinds of corresponding evidence with things like traffic accidents. So young drivers that don't have that cognitive processing where it needs to be are actually more at risk of getting hurt. So we wanted to talk about that. We also wanted to talk about getting psychologists listed specifically on the telehealth initiatives that have been coming out. Because if your profession is not listed, you cannot do those tasks, right? So, we have counselors, social workers, psychologists, psychiatrists. They wanted to make sure that was listed there. And then the last thing, I have recently been tapped, I guess, to become the editor of the Pennsylvania Psychologist because of my passion for subjective qualitative research, because of my interest in really understanding our field and who we are that make it up. So that is kind of my next layer of service for the PPA. Professional development, absolutely. Met lots of really fascinating people that I feel connected with. There's always a face with a name now when I'm looking through our board of directors, when I need to call somebody. I know if it's a legal question, I'm calling up Justin, right? I know if it's Mary Wiley, I'm gonna call her up if it's a membership kinds of question. Growth of new talents, it was a bit intimidating for them to tell me I was gonna now be the editor. But I have been really happy. I've been really supported in this, and I've been learning a lot of new skills and a lot of new talents of how to do this. And one of the best things for my professional development was really understanding how my leadership style could be applied directly in the classroom today, right? This really helped me to understand that even though I tend to want to be the person that wants everybody's opinion, that for some folks, they want a clearer direction. And so I apply that now by asking for everyone's opinion and then offering a summary at the end of the discussion. This is what I'm hearing. Does this sound right? And that allows people to have that direction. Future plans, continue research. I really want to look at the experiences of undergraduate students who are diverse and looking at the field of psychology, particularly clinicians, and what things we're doing well, what things we could do better, how we could really make these diverse voices heard. I think we only benefit from having diversity in our field. We're studying human beings, So if we only study one kind of human being, that's really a disservice. I'm thrilled to be a voice for subjective data, because I know in the era of STEM that everybody likes numbers. Ironic, I would follow the math guy. But that subjective data is really important to tell us what the human experience is. And then I really want to encourage my students to start to present at the Pennsylvania Psychological Association Convention. There's some wonderful opportunities, and I'd really love to see some of that research being done. And then I want to thank Dr. Pickens for writing my recommendation letter that allowed me to do the program. Mary O'Leary Wiley, who was in charge of the program and really was our go-to person. Diane Salter, who was my mentor for my Emerging Leaders year and my research. And then Tracy Passad, who is my kind of ongoing mentor for editing kinds of questions. So the PPA is really nice. When you get into a position, they always have somebody who was in that position the year before that then helps you through that and gets you on your feet. So I knew we didn't have a lot of time. I did that quickly. Are there questions? Yes?
Going back to your research, you said being white and male was most protected. Being male but non-white gave you some protection. I'm assuming you found a similar relationship that being white but female gave you some protection?
Yes. Yeah.
Well, my question is this. Are you more protected by virtue of being male but not white, or white but not male?
Gender seemed to be more productive or more protective than race. Yeah. And a lot of that came down to things with childcare, family, those kinds of things. I think those are still very much seen as jobs of women in our field. Other questions? Okay.
Just as Shannon is proud of the people whose pictures she represented there, we're proud of you, and congratulations on being editor of the journal. That's great. And thanks to all of you. I appreciate your being with us today. Our next Thiel Forum will be on Thursday, November 16th. And again, we'll have quite an interesting group of people. Dane Clausen will discuss his travels to Cambodia. Dr. Johnson will discuss his faculty development grant from spring 2016. And Dr. Sheila Nowinski will discuss the Council of Independent Colleges seminar she attended on art history at Yale University. So thank you very much for being here. And we have some refreshments. Please enjoy them. And happy Halloween. Thank you.